really quickly, before we get started, I do want to say a quick just word of thanks and gratitude to our staff. Last week, yes, Woo is right. So last week we did the ministry architect workshop in here, and I know a lot of you were in here for that, and a lot of hopefully very helpful interaction and feedback. But in the midst of all of that, I thought to myself, I really hope at some point somebody says something about how great our staff is here, and then I remembered, oh right, they give me a microphone like every other week, so I can just do it. So I do really just quickly want to say we have an incredible staff here at the Well. You have no idea. Yes. That was a little weak. It was a little disappointing. I don't like to. Yeah, there we go. That's the enthusiasm. So I say this. I feel like I have to give a caveat here. I do not consider myself to be a staff member here. I'm on the teaching team alongside Ashley, which I'm very grateful for and I really enjoy doing. But I am in no way a part of what goes into making this whole place run every single week, and all of the sweat and energy and just heart that goes in to making sure this place continues to run and function. It's a really, and I've been on church staffs before, it's a really hard job. And it usually, and I don't know what anybody here makes, it usually does not pay very well, and it usually requires a lot of time and energy. And it's one of the only jobs you can have where people that you think you're friends with will come every week and watch what you're doing and think quietly to themselves, I could do that better than them. There are very few jobs where that's the case. And our staff, they do it so well, and they put so much into this place. And if you want to know who all is on staff, you can go to our website. You can take a look at the staff page. I won't try and name everybody, but I will say every single person that is on our staff team deserves as much gratitude and recognition as we can possibly give them, because they really do such an incredible job, and I'm so grateful to be at a church where that's the case. So I did want to take a moment and just express that to everybody. It's got nothing to do with the sermon, but I did want to say it anyway. So I'll just transition right into what we actually did come to talk about. So we are in the middle of this series that we started a few, like 4 or 5 weeks ago, I guess. I've kind of lost time. But in what the series is called, as you saw in the video, is We Shall Overcome. And what we're talking about with this series is our relationship with power. And when we look at the scriptures, how does the scriptures kind of position the people of the way of Jesus over against or in alignment with systems of power? So that's been a big part of what we've been talking about. It's been the whole theme of the whole series. And so far, most of what we've looked at have been stories out of what we refer to as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and stories of how people have or have not interacted with systems of power, or how that has benefited them or harmed them in some sort of way. And so today, we're going to transition into stories of Jesus, and we're going to specifically look at one specific phrase or one specific interaction that Jesus has that I think probably has been, I don't even want to say misinterpreted. I want to say like reduced and made to be a lot smaller than it was originally meant to be. And so we're going to take a look at that. It's probably a phrase you've heard before, and we're going to look at that in just a few minutes. But first, really quickly, I want to tell you a story. Oh, that's early. So that's, pretend like you didn't see that. So I went to seminary in Waco, Texas, at Truett Seminary, which is part of Baylor University. And while I was in seminary there, one of the things about going to seminary is you are going to school every single day with people who are all mostly trying to find jobs in churches or hoping at some point to get a job in a church. And so a lot of my classmates over time started getting jobs at churches that were within driving distance of Waco. So lots of like small Texas towns, like mostly Baptist churches in these small Texas towns, were hiring people that I was going to school with. And I remember one day I was in class, it was a Monday morning, and a guy that I was buddies with came in and he sat down, and I said, hey man, how was you? He had just been hired a couple of weeks earlier at one of these little churches. And I said, hey, how was week 2 of your job as pastor or interim pastor at this church? And he goes, well, I almost got fired. And so I said, please say more right now. Like I'm sure we're about to hear an interesting story. And he said, okay, so I was in the sanctuary, and the space that is kind of like this is often in these old churches, like often referred to as a sanctuary, and it's usually like kind of like a longer straight back room with like pews on either side and an aisle up the middle. And so up here where I am, usually it's probably a platform that's about half as high as the one I'm standing on, and in the middle you have something called a pulpit. This is where whoever is preaching or talking is standing, and then on either side. And so this guy was telling me, so I'm in our sanctuary, and on either side of the pulpit, now you can throw the drawing up. So I drew this, which is why it's so great. And so on one side of the pulpit, there is a cross, which you can see in lots of churches. Like, that's obviously a very representative symbol of what we're here talking about and doing and trying to align ourselves with. And he said on the other side of the pulpit, of the stage, of the platform, was a giant American flag. And he said, I was standing in the sanctuary right before the services started, before everybody got there, and I had this sort of like moment of dissonance of, this doesn't look right to me. And I guess because he was new to Texas or something, he decided, like, I'm gonna move that flag. And so, by the way, when I told this story in the last service, a woman over here audibly gasped, like, oh, I know what's about to happen now. So my friend, his name was Brent, he said, so before anybody even got there, I went up there, I picked up the flag. He said, I didn't even take it out of the sanctuary. I moved it to the back of the room, which is probably like 50 feet away from where it was. So I moved it to the back of the room. He said, you would have thought I tried to set the thing on fire. People were so upset. Like, the whole service was completely disrupted by who moved the flag. We're going to have an elders meeting and try and figure out who moved the flag and how quickly can we get this person fired. And so Brent very quickly was like, yeah, I just put it back there. It's like, it's still in the room. Don't even worry about it. And so they went, so it was like a 2-hour, like, here's why you can never move the flag. And so it became like, look, like, it's either the flag or your job. You have to choose right now. So I asked him, I said, so what'd you do? He said, I put the flag back. I just got this job. So, but this is not unusual. Like, I would imagine a lot of us probably grew up in a church where maybe it wasn't exactly this setup, but probably there was something kind of similar to this, which is this image of we are participating in two things at once. One thing is represented by a cross, and the other is represented by a flag. And this is not, again, it's not at all unusual. So in certain parts of this country and in certain Christian denominations and churches, the flag and the cross have become entangled. And probably a lot of us have grown up in systems where we've seen this. And so much so that even the fact that I'm talking about is like, yeah, why are we talking about this? It's a totally normal thing. So the flag and the cross have become this entangled sort of interactive unit where the two are basically equal in the eyes of a lot of people who talk about these two things. So to these groups, your faith and your patriotism are interlocked. In other words, if you aren't a Christian, you're not a good American. And if you are not patriotic enough, you are a bad Christian. Are you with me? There is that sort of dual way of seeing this and talking about this. And so there is this message where sometimes verbally and sometimes non-verbally, we send this image or this message of these two things to us are equally valuable, have equal importance to us. So there seems to be an assumption among lots of Christians that Jesus is American, Jesus prefers American, and Jesus' favorite football team is the Dallas Cowboys because that's America's team. So, sorry, there were a couple of non-Cowboy fans in here last service who were like, wait a minute. And so like that, but so there is this sense of like, well, obviously Jesus is patriotic and Jesus loves America just as much as we're supposed to love America. And so this seems to be an assumption that we sort of have in like sort of a subtextual way and sometimes overtly in and around like certain churches and cultures. So the current series, what we're doing is we're talking about all the different ways that the Bible confronts and deals with power. And because the flag is this specific image that refers to certain things about like specifically American power and might and how it's juxtaposed with the cross, the question becomes, what is actually supposed to be the relationship between these two items? Visibly, if you're just looking at these two things, what message are we receiving? And is that message okay? Or is there something inherently broken about that message? So today we're going to talk about patriotism, and we're going to talk about the way of Jesus and how these two things do or do not interact with each other. And we're going to talk about flags, and we're going to talk about crosses. And in America, this is about as much of a sacred cow as we've got. So I do want to say from the outset, for those of you who are sitting here and you're thinking, I am so glad we're talking about this. This has always been something that I've wanted to talk about, and I feel like it's been one of those taboo things that it's not okay to bring up. So for those of you who are sitting here thinking, like, I'm glad we're finally giving ourselves space to have this conversation, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And for those of you who right now are sharpening your knives and drafting your angry emails to me for later, I'm really sorry for how upset this is about to make you. And if you need to voice that emotion of being upset, Ashley Engel will be in the foyer right after the service. She loves hearing about how much you hated my sermons. So all that to say, sorry, Ashley, you might want to make a run for it. Anyway, so all that to say, we are going to talk about some stuff that at its face is going to feel a little bit like, oh, I don't know if it's okay for us to talk about. But then we have to ask the question, why do we have that feeling? Why does just having this conversation automatically feel like dangerous ground? Why do we have such weird emotions when it comes to things like flags and crosses? So we're going to talk about all of this, but first we have to talk about what's going on in the first century and why Jesus is talking about things like crosses and power and nationalism at all. So in the first century, and we're going to be looking at this passage in Matthew in a second, but in the first century, all of the what we refer to as the New Testament, all of it is coded by the fact that all of this is coming out of a space and time that is occupied and conquered by the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire has conquered the Judean territory and all of the Jewish citizens who live inside of that territory, which means these are people who are not Roman, but still have to act as if they are deferential to Rome, otherwise it could get them killed. So you have this group of people who are living in this time. They are occupied, they are conquered, they are ruled by Caesar. But again, they do not see themselves as Roman citizens. They see themselves as an occupied people. And so at the time, there are these different factions of people who have different ideas and preferences about how should we live. Like, since we are conquered, that's a given, how are we supposed to live inside of a conquered space? So there are all these different factions, and there are these two polar opposite factions we're going to talk about, and all of them with different philosophies about how to deal with Rome. So on one side of the spectrum, you have a group of people who say, look, don't fight it. Just lean into it. Like, Rome is in charge. There's nothing we can do about it. Maybe if we play our cards right, we can actually get more powerful and more rich as a result of this. Maybe we can leverage this to our advantage. So there were some people who were getting closer and closer intentionally to the seat of power because they knew, look, you can't fight it, so we might as well do whatever we can to get as much for ourselves as is available. So you have this group of people who are doing this. And by the way, and we'll talk about this in a second, but one of the words for this group of people was the Herodians. And the reason they were called Herodians is because the puppet king that had been installed by Caesar over the Jewish people was a guy named Herod the Great. And so Herod becomes this person who gets to keep his power because he's doing a really good job of doing whatever Caesar wants him to do. So you have this group of people, the Herodians, who decide we're going to get as close to Herod as possible. We're just going to be as cooperative and agreeable as we possibly can, because Herod will continue to see us as allies and trustworthy and people that he can give his, like, whatever extra power he's got to us. So you have this group of people called the Herodians, whose whole purpose is, as far as they can see it, is to get as close to power as possible and to not rock the boat at all. That's on one side of the spectrum. On the far other end of the spectrum, you have a group of people who are full-on resistors. You have people who, and the furthest to that side would have been a group of people called the Zealots. And this is a group of people who say, not only should we not conform to the fact that Rome is here, we should do everything we can to resist. And again, the furthest to that side of it, the Zealots would have said, like, we are willing to commit violence in order to get what we want. They will, like, not only are we willing to commit violence against Roman soldiers and citizens, we will commit violence against fellow Jewish citizens if we see them cooperating with the Romans. So these are the two sides of the spectrum. Lots of people somewhere in between in those 2 points. So most people fall somewhere in the middle of these two polar extremes. So now, at this, or I guess prior to the passage we're about to look at the beginning of, again, what we refer to as the New Testament. And you're going to see this name show up coming up because we're about to get into Christmas, and this happens during the Christmas story. Caesar Augustus, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, imposed on the people. So there were lots of different groups, not just the Jews, but also the people in other territories who were occupied by the Roman Empire. And so Caesar Augustus he creates what became referred to as the head tax, or more often referred to as the imperial tax or the census tax. So this is why at the beginning of the Christmas story, you have a story of people going to their place of birth. Why? Because we need to know how many people are conquered so that we can know how much of this particular tax to collect. So this was a way, the imperial tax is a very specific tax, and its whole purpose for existing is to only tax people who are non-Roman citizens in occupied Roman territories. So Roman citizens do not have to pay the imperial tax because that's one of the privileges of being a Roman citizen. But Jewish people living in Rome-occupied Judea do have to pay the imperial tax. So paying the tax is a reminder of your subjugation. Every time you pay the tax, you are in a nonverbal way being reminded, I am here at the mercy of Caesar. And even though I am not a Roman citizen, I still have to defer and bow down to Caesar. So there's this thing called the imperial tax that, again, was imposed by Caesar Augustus. So the question of do I or do I not pay the census tax or the imperial tax becomes a big point of controversy at the time because, again, you got people at either end of the spectrum. You have some people who are like, absolutely you pay the imperial tax. Otherwise, you're just going to get yourself in trouble. And where's that going to get you? Like, if you're going to cooperate, you got to cooperate, which means paying the imperial tax. And then you have other people who say, absolutely not. You do not pay the imperial tax because that's just acknowledging that Caesar has power over us, and we're not willing to acknowledge that. So this is actually a major point of controversy in first century Judea at this time, because if you pay the tax, you're acknowledging Caesar's power. If you don't pay the tax, you're putting your life at risk. So all of that is what's going on when we start in Matthew chapter 22. So in Matthew 22, beginning in verse 15, it says this. It says, then the Pharisees, which is a group that we will talk about in a second, but we haven't yet. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him being Jesus, in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach a way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Then tell us, what is your opinion? In other words, like they are buttering this guy up because they think it's going to get him to be a little bit more honest with what he really thinks because they know that that's where the trap is. So then it says, so then tell us, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? So, classic question presented to Jesus, should we or should we not pay the imperial tax? This is not, should we or should we not pay taxes? A lot of times this question gets boiled down to, like this passage gets read through that lens of, well, should I or should I not pay taxes? Like that's a pretty straightforward answer, right? That's not at all the question. The question is not, should you pay the taxes that every citizen has to pay? No. This is, should we pay the imperial tax? Should we, with our money, acknowledge that we are subjects under Caesar? So, now what's interesting here is you've got these two groups of people who are named in the story. You've got the Pharisees, and we already talked about the Herodians. What's interesting about these two groups of people, they have nothing in common. They agree on zero. Neither of them gets along at all with the others. So why are these two groups of people teaming up to come and ask Jesus this question? What is the point of this? Well, this is why. The one thing that these two groups of people do have in common, they do not like what Jesus is up to, and that is where they meet in the middle. Because again, this is not should we or should we not pay our taxes. This is a much more volatile question than that. So, and I mentioned already who the Herodians are. These are the people who are trying to get close to power and wealth so that they can get power and wealth for themselves. So the idea of paying the imperial tax is like, well, of course, because we're trying to keep Caesar happy with us, so why wouldn't we pay the imperial tax? The Pharisees, however, are a resistance group. They're not as far to the extreme as the Zealots were because they believed in nonviolence. But they did not think, let's just go along to get along. In fact, the Pharisees are offended by the very existence of the Roman Empire in this place and in this time. The Pharisees believe that the Roman Empire has conquered this space because God is punishing them for being not holy enough. So the Pharisees believe if we can be as holy as possible and we can demonstrate to God that we are holy, then God will rescue us from the Roman Empire. So any sort of giving in to the Roman Empire or doing anything that is seen as cooperative with Rome is seen as less holy or non-pious. And so they would have felt that was offensive. But again, it's a non-violent group. So they are opposing Jesus specifically because Jesus is pushing the boundaries on what is and isn't considered holy, who is and isn't part of the tribe. That's a big part of it. But also there's the assumption that Jesus is preparing to lead a violent revolution. So there is fear among both groups that Jesus is trying to get basically a group of followers together so that he can rise up and force Rome to leave this territory. That's the assumption. So both groups see that as bad for business. So the Pharisees don't want it because it's just going to make life harder for everybody else, and because it's going to just set them back. The Herodians don't want it because if it works, then it's going to disrupt their system of power. Both groups are highly invested in shutting Jesus down. So they come to Jesus with this question. And so Jesus knows exactly who is asking him this question. He knows that the one thing these two groups have in common is they want to shut him down as fast as possible. So they believe that Jesus is about to again, lead a revolution, and they're trying to stop it. So far, this is the kind of question that can actually get a person killed. Regardless of how they answer, depending on who's asking the question, this could be a really sticky question. So they feel like they've got Jesus in a corner. The Herodians think, well, if Jesus says that not to pay the tax, then we've got him and he's subverting the will of Caesar and we can have him arrested. And the Pharisees are thinking if he says, yeah, pay the tax, then he's a sellout. And that kind of kills the momentum of the revolution. If you're trying to lead a revolution and you tell everybody pay the imperial tax, everybody following you is going to be like, well, this guy's just in it to save his own hide. Like there's no integrity here. So both groups see this as being like, no matter how he answers, we've got him. So that's why this is such a loaded passage that we tend to sort of dismiss and minimize. So they ask, should we or should we not pay the imperial tax? Then in verse 18, it says, Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away, which it sounds like, at face value, it sounds like he's saying, like, yeah, you live in Rome, Caesar runs Rome, pay the tax. Like, it sounds like he's answering yes to the question, doesn't it? So why are they amazed, and why did they leave discouraged? It sounds to me like he just gave them exactly what they wanted. But that's not how they heard it. Why? What's going on here? So this passage, again, is often used as a way of telling people, just obey the law. Like that, just whatever the laws are, just obey those laws and everything will be fine. In fact, the first time I can remember hearing this passage preached, I was probably like in junior high or high school at a small church. And the pastor was telling, this was the passage he was preaching on, and he told this very personal story about himself. I say very personal, to him, it was a very personal story. And the story was that he had gotten a speeding ticket recently. And he'd been going like 5 miles over the speed limit, and he got pulled over, and he was so ashamed. Like this guy saw himself as being so like upright and pious. And so he said, first of all, I should never have been speeding because that is not giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. And so to him, giving to Caesar what is Caesar's is driving the speed limit. Which, I mean, hey, if everybody in Edmond only thought that, like, hey, we're making progress, apply that to not running stop signs, and we really got ourselves a society. So anyway, so this pastor is telling this story, like, I'm going to tell you guys something, and it's not something I'm proud of. I got a speeding ticket for going 5 miles over. And the thing is, I shouldn't have done that because we have to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. To him, that means like obeying, like not like committing misdemeanors and getting speeding tickets. You know, like is this passage really that small that it's like that's as much as we can get out of it? Or is there something way bigger going on in the story? Here's the problem with that reading. Jesus is eventually killed by the Roman Empire. I promise you, it wasn't because he was so good at following laws. Are you with me? So here's what's actually going on in this story. You could not pay the imperial tax with regular money. That was like there were certain coins that were used for certain taxes. And the imperial tax was used by a specific kind of denarius, and there was a particular coin that was used for paying this specific tax. The tax is designed in such a way to remind people, again, that they are subjugated under the Roman Empire. So the type of coin that they use is actually an important part of that messaging. So here's a picture of this coin. I preached this once in a church that did not have screens. So I had to draw the coin. It was awful. It looked like a globe. So I'm really glad I was able to like actually use a picture here. So this is actually a picture of the coin that would have been used at this time. The emperor at the time of this story would have been Caesar Tiberius. This is an image of Caesar Tiberius on the coin. And then there's an inscription in Latin around the side. And the inscription literally says, worship Tiberius Caesar, worshipful son of the divine Augustus. So why is that important? Well, because the belief, beginning with Caesar Augustus began to circulate the idea that whoever was in charge of whoever the emperor of Rome was, specifically whoever held the title of Caesar, was not just a ruler. That person was the son of God. There was actually a phrase that they would use, like when Augustus came to power, someone saw a comet in the sky, and they came to Caesar Augustus and said, Emperor, Augustus, like, what was that? What was the comet that we just saw? And of course, being a great opportunist, Augustus said, of course you saw a comet. That was my father, Julius Caesar, ascending to the right hand of the gods, because now he is a god. And that begins the idea that whoever is Caesar is also the Son of God, which is why it's so subversive when people refer to Jesus as the Son of God, because that wasn't just a name they came up with. It was over and against what Caesar was calling himself. So this coin says Tiberius Caesar, worshipful son of the divine Augustus. In other words, this coin holds on it, is inscribed with an affirmation that Caesar is God. So the belief was that this specific coin was not simply a piece of currency that you would use to trade for goods and services. This coin was a false idol. The existence of this coin was considered to be a false idol. So to even possess the coin was considered an act of worshiping false gods. Even having the coin would have been seen as controversial depending on who has it. So one of the reasons this question is so controversial, when they asked Jesus, should we or should we not pay the imperial tax, the question behind the question is, should we or should we not even handle money that is used as an idol to a false god? So, by the way, watch what happens when Jesus is asked the question. Look at, let's see if we can go back. So it says, Jesus, knowing their evil intent, says, you hypocrites, you're trying to trap me. So they've asked him, should we or should we not pay the imperial tax? In verse 19, Jesus says, show me a coin used for paying the tax. They brought him one. What does that tell you? It tells you, one, Jesus is like, well, I would love to answer your question, but I don't actually have one of those coins. Does anybody here happen to have one? And of course, one of the, I would argue, probably less crafty people in the crowd was like, oh yeah, I've got one. Which that gives up the game right there. If you've got the coin, you've answered the question for yourself, right? Having the coin in and of itself gives it up. You've given yourself away. So Jesus is like, well, I don't have a coin. If somebody else has one, I'd be happy to talk more about this. And somebody's like, yeah, I've got one. So somebody else produces the coin. Whoever has the coin has basically just said, I'm fine with the imperial tax. I regularly pay the imperial tax. So, depending on which group this person came out of, that's embarrassing. It doesn't tell us whether or not it was a Herodian or a Pharisee. If it's a Pharisee, probably everybody would have been like, hey man, why did you have that coin? That would have, in and of itself, been a little bit embarrassing. So the answer that Jesus gives is, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. The answer is in the possessive tense. Something here physically belongs to Caesar. And Jesus basically says, okay, if it belongs to Caesar, give it to Caesar. So here's where it actually gets controversial. Because the implication is, if there are certain things that do belong to Caesar, there must also be certain things that don't belong to Caesar. This is where it gets quite subversive really quickly. Because the assumption is, in the Roman Empire, where Caesar is Lord, everything belongs to Caesar. Jesus says, whose face is on the coin? Well, it's Caesar's. Okay, well, then just give it to Caesar. But then the question becomes, yeah, but what doesn't belong to Caesar? Some of the people in the story, specifically the Herodians, have given Caesar way too much. They have given him their unquestioning support over and against their neighbors and their fellow citizens. People are suffering because he's getting support from this other group of people. They've given Caesar something that never should have belonged to Caesar in the first place. The implication here is Caesar doesn't own you. Caesar doesn't own your body. Caesar doesn't own your integrity. Caesar does not own your morality or your principles. Caesar is not entitled to any of the things that make you who you were always meant to be in the world. That doesn't belong to Caesar. And if you give it to Caesar, you've given something that doesn't belong to him. So the issue with the coin and its connection to Rome is that it served as an idol. So people looked at Caesar and they poured themselves out in devotion to Caesar. And Jesus understands that this does create a dilemma for everybody who's listening. That's the point. The point is, yeah, we understand that this is a weird place to be. This should be a problem that we wrestle with. And notice, by the way, Jesus does not draw two columns and say, like, okay, let's take a minute, let's do a group exercise here. We'll just list on this column all the things that do belong to Caesar, and then in this column, all the things that don't belong to Caesar. He does not do that. Why? Because that's too easy. It's too simplistic to just start listing things that do and don't belong to Caesar. Jesus leaves that up to us. He says, I guess it's up to you to determine what does and doesn't belong to Caesar. I think the challenge that Jesus is offering us here is let's consider all the things that you have given to Caesar that never should have been given away in the first place. That's the real tension in the story. There are some things that belong to this system that are diametrically opposed to what God is doing in the world. Things like violence and coercion and fear-mongering and nationalism and forced acts of patriotism. These are all artifacts of a kingdom that is not of God. If you have strong opinions about other people's patriotism, and you have made judgments about that person's like value in the world based on how they position their body during certain patriotic songs, let's say, then have you given something to Caesar that never belonged to Caesar in the first place? There is a kingdom of the flag, and there is a kingdom of the cross. And these two things are very different realities. And Jesus is forcing people to ask, have I given too much to Caesar already? Look at Matthew chapter 20. This is a couple chapters earlier, but it also deals with the dynamics of power. So in Matthew chapter 20, in verse 20, it says, then the mother of Zebedee's sons, which Zebedee's has two sons who are Jesus' followers, James and John. So it says their mom came to Jesus with her sons, kneeling down, asked for a favor of him. What is it you want? Jesus asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine might sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. In other words, and by the way, they don't, like, what she's not saying is, like, once everybody's dead here, can we all make sure that we all end up in the right seats in the next place where we're going to go? That's not the question. She believes, along with lots of other people at this time, that when this whole thing is over, Jesus will have thrown the Roman Empire out, and Jesus will now be in charge of everything. And so what she's asking is, I want to make sure my sons have the two best seats next to you, have the most amount of power just behind you. You know how you get your mom to go to your boss and ask for stuff like that. So this is what we have going on in this story. And so Jesus says, so it says, you don't know what you're asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? Of course, we understand he means, I'm about to go through a movement of self-sacrifice and death even, for the benefit of others. She doesn't know. She does not understand that that's where this is headed. So it says, we can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared for by my Father. When the 10 heard about this, in other words, the other disciples who don't have a mom like this, who don't have like a mom who like is going to call the school board every time something happens. So then it says, when the 10 heard, if that's you, then God bless, good parenting. But it says, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. In other words, we didn't know we could ask our moms to ask for this kind of stuff. So then in verse 25, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, which everybody knows he's talking about the Romans, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and have their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servants, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man, who's referring to himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What is going on here? These two guys come to Jesus, or their mom comes to Jesus and says, I would really like it if my sons had not quite as much power as you, but just like just a little bit less power than you. And Jesus is pointing out what you're asking for and expecting is a system that runs on flags and coins. And you're going to be very disappointed when it turns out to not work that way. We are all very familiar with the kind of system that runs on intimidation and fear and military strength. Jesus says, like, we all know what this looks like. It looks like Rome. Jesus is saying, my movement doesn't work that way. My movement is not about like power and strength and nationalism or political persuasion. It's actually about serving other people and powerlessness and humility. It doesn't look the way you think it's going to look. The cross, which is often equated with the flag in the story we talked about earlier, but is actually in many ways a critique of flags and coins. The cross is an instrument of sacrifice and death. It's a place of intentional surrendering of power. A flag, by contrast, is often seen as an image of conquest or dominance, not unlike a Roman coin. This is how we show where we've been and what we own, right? If you were visiting a foreign country and you needed to go to the American embassy, you would go to where the American flag is, and that flag will tell you, if I go into this space, I am a prioritized citizen because this is the flag that represents me. So Jesus basically says, you're expecting a flag, but I'm going to show you a cross, and it's going to be quite confusing for lots of us. The system of the cross is a movement of grace and mercy and hospitality and love. The system of Caesar, the coin or the flag or whatever, is by nature fueled by conquest and strength and, dare I say, forced patriotism and violence. A flag, these two things operate in very different ways. A flag is exclusive, is by nature, it is exclusive and nationalistic. That's why it's a flag. And by the way, I'm not trying to badmouth things like flags and patriotism. The use and image of a flag can be a powerful reminder of our history and our ideals. It can remind you of where we've come from and the story that got us to where we are. But what I am trying to do is acknowledge that even at its best, a flag does have limitations. It has boundaries. Think about the Olympics, like the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, or any time Olympic athletes are interacting with other Olympic athletes. What do you see? You have people who are in a spirit of like good faith and like friendly competition interacting with each other. But at the end of it all, one goes back to one flag and the other goes back to another flag. Are you with me? So the flag in and of itself, by its nature, represents some sort of difference between one group of people and another group of people. There is still some invisible line between people who live under one flag and people who live under another flag. A flag, by nature, represents some amount of exclusivity. This belongs to us. This is who we are, as opposed to who they are. Some people are represented by this flag, and by nature, some people are not represented by this flag. A flag, again, a flag marks like, this is my territory. There's an American flag on the moon. You guys, we call dibs on the moon. So the moon belongs to us. Why? Well, there's the flag. We said so, right? So what does a flag represents? This is ours. Everything that doesn't go under this flag belongs to somebody else. But what we care about is what goes under this flag. So a flag is by nature exclusive and nationalistic. That's just the nature of it, good or bad. The cross, by contrast, is by nature inclusive and open. If the cross is offered to all people and represents an act of self-sacrifice and grace, then it cannot be seen as possessing the same set of ideals and expectations as a flag. These are two very different pieces of imagery. Look at Revelation chapter 5. So in Revelation 5, you've got, and I realize I'm starting to go over time. I apologize. I feel really bad about that, but we have so much ground to cover, and I can only talk so fast. So in Revelation 5, you have this guy named John who's writing to a group of churches at what we now refer to as southern Turkey. At the time, it was called Asia Minor. And he's describing, he says, I have seen what things are going to look like when everything becomes what it was meant to be, when what we refer to as the kingdom of God becomes a reality in our world. What will that look like? So in Revelation 5, beginning in verse 9, it says, and they, the people who were there, sang a new song, saying, you, Jesus, are worthy to take the scroll and open its seal, because you were slain, and with your blood purchased for God persons. So he's talking about the cross. He's saying through the cross, you have connected yourself to and rescued people from, and then it says, from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them into a kingdom of priests to serve our God, and they will reign on earth. And this word reign does not mean like be in charge of. This word reign means participate alongside of. So the writer is showing us something. The writer is saying the cross is a place where Jesus dies. And with that sacrifice, Jesus creates space for people from, quote, every tribe and language and people and nation. So these words are super interesting. So there are these four words. They all mean something different in Greek. The word tribe, real quickly, literally means, it could also mean like race or class or any sort of distinctive group. When we talk about how tribal things are, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about groups of people who are, by nature, set apart from other groups of people. And so what's being said here is when this whole thing becomes what it was always meant to be, the lines between all the different tribes will begin to blur. So you have this kind of language, and then it says language, every language, which in Greek is the word glossa, and this literally means language, like every dialect, every form of jargon, every like way that people are used to talking with each other. All of a sudden, these things will become less and less and less relevant. The next word here is people. It's the word laos in Greek. every group that you can think of. This is any subset of people that groups themselves together for whatever reason, that is a laos. And so what the writer is saying is all these groups will somehow find themselves gathered together in this space. And then the last word, very interestingly, is nation, which literally is the word ethnos. It's where we get the word ethnicity. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about flags. Whatever nation or flag you come from or lived under, at the end of this whole thing, that will become a relic of a time that we no longer participate in. A flag is a relic of another kingdom and another world. The cross endures. The flag, at its best, creates a sense of identity for people who live within the boundaries of where that flag represents. If you go outside of those boundaries, that flag means a lot less, or just means something different. The cross, in contrast, expands the boundaries and continues to get more and more inclusive, never less inclusive. The writer here is giving us a glimpse of the kingdom of God, and he realizes this is a very diverse realm of existence. Flags don't seem to matter that much here anymore. The flag, if all flags become a relic of a time that has passed us by, because now we're in a space where all tribes and languages and nations are gathered under something bigger than a flag. A flag is based in power and conquest and coercion. A flag says, this space is ours. And anybody who doesn't live in this space or who is not represented by this space is not our concern. The cross is based in surrender and self-sacrifice. The cross says everyone is welcome. The cross is the place where everyone, regardless of what flag they do or do not fly, says, this is where I was meant to be. The cross insists that everyone is welcome and that everyone belongs. The challenge of Jesus is not, should I pay my taxes? The real question that's being asked here is, which kingdom am I really participating in? Am I participating in a kingdom that is centered around a flag or a coin, or am I participating in a kingdom of the cross? Because these two things are not in the same business, and they never have been. I'm not saying patriotism or civic engagement is bad at all. I would argue it's good. It can be very healthy to care about the place where you live and to be engaged in what's going on in your space, in your town, city, state, country, whatever. To be an active part of your society is healthy. It's good to do that. But let's not get that confused with what it means to participate in a story that is about the kingdom of God. Those are two very different things. So if you feel a deep sense of patriotism and pride in your country, great. You should love where you live. You should care about the place where you live. You should care about your neighbors and fellow citizens, regardless of what they believe or how they engage in those beliefs. It should matter to you what's going on in your community. But the cross and the flag, again, have never been in the same business. And when we act like they are, we are misleading ourselves, and we're participating in two things that do not look the same. Jesus says, yeah, there are most certainly things that do belong to Caesar. We aren't going to pretend like that's not true. There are things that Caesar is entitled to. But there are also so many more things that do not belong to Caesar. And he cannot have them unless you give them to him. When we are willing to disregard the well-being of other people in the name of giving more power to Caesar or gaining more power or wealth or access, then we have given away something that should have never belonged to Caesar in the first place. In those moments, we are actively working against what the cross is trying to do in the world. Jesus is saying, you've got to figure out what belongs to Caesar and what doesn't. Because when we give Caesar things that he should never have been given, it begins to chip away at our souls. Not just individually, but as a society, we become less human in the eyes of one another. We become less curious. We become less grace-oriented. We become less willing to engage in the needs of others because it's about which group am I in, which party do I belong to, how many flags can I put in my yard on 4th of July. It becomes about all of these metrics that we've invented. We've given Caesar way more than we ever should have. So may we give to Caesar what actually does belong to Caesar. But then also, may we recognize that the things that don't belong to Caesar, or what doesn't belong to Caesar, and may we choose not to give those things away. Caesar can only have those things if you give them away. May we never allow our sense of citizenship or patriotism to cause us to become less open or generous or loving or hopeful or gracious towards others. May we choose to say those things do not belong to Caesar, and Caesar can't have them. May we acknowledge that the cross and the flag are in two very different kinds of business. And may we never falsely equate either. May we choose to be the kinds of people who recognize what does not belong to Caesar, and may we hold on to that, and may it make us more loving, hopeful, gracious, and others-oriented as we move through our lives.